my screen. And I just want to make sure that everyone can see. If someone can turn their audio on and just let me know. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay. Just for the recording, if everyone can turn off their audio button, that would be great. And unfortunately, I can't see everybody like I could in Zoom. So I want to let you know that as well. So I'm only looking into a blank void of my computer and the screen here. Okay. Well, without holding any more time, I want to go ahead and get started. So I have presented on this before. I just want to give people the heads up. I have updated my slides to reflect current events, and I'm really wanting to hold space for our community, Asian Pacific Islander community, our loved ones, our family, and also for our allies. So this is coming on the heels of last Tuesday. And I'm also wanting to recognize the space being held for those impacted in Boulder, Colorado as well. Today, we are going to focus on Asian Pacific Islander mental health. We're really glad you came here to the Student Counseling Center's Mental Health Symposium, and really at a relevant and timely moment in our history, as well as a movement within our community. So thank you in advance. So I do want to first start as well with a land acknowledgement related to the native land of which I'm speaking from. So I'm here in the Plano, Texas area, and I want to honor and acknowledge the land that was stolen from the native land of the Sioux, the Cherokee, Iroquois, and who were descended from Incan and Mayan peoples. I want to acknowledge that we, including myself, are settlers on this land that is sacred, and acknowledge that it is our duty to acknowledge elders and acknowledge that we must protect and care for this land as part of ourselves, as an extension of who we are as individuals, and also the violence that has happened against marginalized people, including our API community, on sacred land. And just recognizing the historical and fundamental nature of that harm and that pain and that generational holding that the land has both given us and what has happened to it. I think it is important. I may be speaking to the not think it's important. It is important to recognize there are 48 Asian countries, and that is also including significant territories from Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Macau, from Polynesian, Hawaii, all these areas that make up part of the Asian countries. So when we look at the monolith of when we identify as Asian, it is very critical to know that we are anything but monolith, that we are individualized, we are fundamentally and ethnically unique in how we identify and who we are as APIs. And I think that's forgotten quite a bit and invisibilized purposefully and generationally. I want to hold space to remember the names within our community. Zhao Ji Tan, Zhao Yu Fang, Sun Cha Kim, Yang A Yu, Su Jung Park, Hyungju Grant, Delana Ashley Yao Gonzalez, and Paul Andre Michaels. I'm just holding space for their names and what they have, their lives and what they embodied. And as we talk about the considerations that are thematic within the community and thematic of what may come up during session. So part of my work as a therapist, long before I came here to UTD, was really working within marginalized systems, working within communities of color, communities who also intersectionally identify within the LGBTQ communities, transgender, non-binary, disability, those who hold neurodiversity, the ethnic uniqueness, and also immigration status, those who hold adoptee and fosteree identities, those who are multiracial, and those who hold varying religious beliefs. The kaleidoscope of all these intersectional identities make up our community. And for so long, these disparities related to who we are as individuals have really been replaced with this monolithic, generalist idea of this model minority, or what Asians should or shouldn't be, particularly here in Western culture. And this has a direct impact on mental health. It has direct impact also on mental health provisions. When we look at this very westernized medical model, related, really housed in colonialism. And so I'm speaking from a frame of reference of decolonizing mental health, decolonizing how this has impacted our community specifically, because we as individuals are diverse. There are unique aspects that I can only share out. I'm definitely not here to represent all APIs, but definitely share out the intersectionalities of the themes that come up. And so, acculturation and how this is synthesized into family systems is quite significant in terms of immigration, in terms of how or what brought family systems here into the West or into the place that they have settled. Where do you claim home to be? Where do you claim your peoples to be or people? Where do you claim name and namesake from? And how has that then informed not only our language, but the way that we have navigated really Western culture and society and how we traverse that if we have privilege to go back to a land of origin or see family of origin. For those who hold adoptee or fosteree status, maybe not having that direct connection related to first family or birth family or the culture in which you were born from, but raised in Western society and internalize that, or as first 1.5 or second generation, third generation, how have we traversed that and acculturated into what this Western idealism, this idea of independence, and how then does that balance, or how is that even integrated with collectivism and this idea of self sacrifice, this idea of ensuring that we uphold the values and the virtues of our family and of our peoples. And so these considerations move into navigating many different spaces, whether that happens in terms of community, of in community, or outside the community, or navigating between all of these. It can really be energy consuming. And so the term code switching to basically adapt in different kinds of systems, code switching of language, linguistics of dialect, code switching of appearance, code switching even of what we consider professional norms, which is also housed and particularly in white dominant culture. When we talk about how do I show up? Do I show up in this way of in my Asianness, or do I then align myself in white adjacency? And how has that been perpetuated through the model minority stereotype and trope that I remain passive or I remain in this space of not being able to share much? Many times we'll call it the bamboo ceiling within API communities, that I am a frontliner, a perpetual foreigner, but I'm never afforded or allowed pay equity or the positionality to move up. I may not be in leadership. I may not be afforded those spaces or seen as quote unquote leadership material. So how then does that impact our interethnic and cultural history, because we bring that with us, whether that is a known or unknown part of our being, of our heritage, of our embodied part of the land that we came from, and the peoples and the culture and the canon of which we came from, and then how the diaspora of coming into different parts of the world, how is that interspersed interethnically when I meet other ethnicities, but then am assumed to be another ethnicity that I am not, and how that then impacts how I identify culturally. We talk about, but don't really recognize historically the family separation and blended family systems of not only of interracial and intercultural and ethnic marriage, but then also the family separation from the land, the family separation from families of origin to come to create this better life, to come to America per se, and to do these things that may afford great opportunity, but at what cost? And so balancing that out too, as well, is the historical racism and oppression that has been part of the Western lexicon and the Western history for so long. And many times in terms of acculturating, in terms of adapting, there is a generational sometimes and a divide related to that, that so many family systems are merely trying to survive. They're merely trying to get food on the table to ensure that their children have opportunities in which they were not afforded. And so compartmentalizing the impacts of racism and oppression is going to have an impact on the body. It's going to have an impact on our mental health. Compartmentalizing the oppression that is happening, even within being told that it was a bad day when a white supremacist comes in and murders with intentionality members of our community and 6 Asian women. To dismiss that and be gaslit by that is harmful and impactful. And we go back into the historical racism related to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Japanese internment. When we look at the longitudinal history, the inability to gain citizenship fully until 1965, or the ability for APIs to immigrate here in equitability without the merit-based system, which is really housed in this model minority, which is housed in white supremacy. And so when we talk about that, then this idea of the perpetual foreigner continues to manifest and resurface, that I am neither here nor there, but heartfully, mindfully for many, where do I fit in? And I belong here. I deserve to hold space here. And I can also hold space in all these other places of my life. So our histories is phenomenal, and that we don't forget. But these are parts of who we are. And when I talk always about, I hear so often about the racial tension between groups, I call that, well, it's not racial tension. It's the constructs of white supremacy. It's a constructs of decommissioning the identity, the individuality, the humanity of a group of individuals, and how this is played out then for our Asian members of our society, particularly I'm speaking very specifically here in the US, is when we look at the institutional framework of racism, we look at collective prejudice backed by legal, legislative, institutional, and financial power within the dominant society. So just kind of think in terms of generational wealth, in terms of accessibility of who has privilege to immigrate, who has the opportunity to come and then establish themselves and stay with, in terms of speaking out with their voice. If I am on a visa, do I risk that? If I am here on green card, do I risk that and share out between both my family and place of origin and here in this community? And in terms of that, it also then holds sometimes our voice in the space of I'm not quite sure what to do. Ambiguity. So when we rationalize to uphold this institution, a lot of this is internalized. And it doesn't take a lot then to stay and perpetuate or uphold these systems. And this is really hard, I think, as I hear this. I've had to deconstruct this throughout my lifetime, particularly as in the last several years of just deconstructing how this shows up internally when I look at how this is affecting our communities. So it's not just it is a system. It's not just individual acts. So many times we consider it's just when people are overtly racist, but these are systems, structural and institutional. And so this lends itself to identity-based stress and trauma. So I'll say it again, identity-based stress and trauma. Trauma is when we have action or behavior from other individuals that it is not predictable, and it can feel terrifying, and it can feel terrorizing. All of these things are housed in oppression, xenophobia, racism, and xenophobia as well. So xenophobia, very quickly, you may have already heard about this, but it is a sense of fright of outsiders, an attitude that one's own group or culture is superior to another. And prejudice toward recent immigrants to the US. This has been happening, though, historically. So there has been multiple policies and legislation. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act ultimately excluded and barred anyone of API descent and identity from immigrating into the US for over 85 years. So just holding that in context and perspective related to voice, related to privilege, related to even the ability to vote and to be even seen as a US citizen, because during that time Asians were barred and excluded from US citizenship. So what that also meant is, what else are you barred from? Property ownership, voting rights, educational opportunities, and systemically opportunities that would build not just wealth, but build identity and a sense of being seen and known in equitability in the community, as well as barring also the number, just the power of number, and the number of individuals who identify as API were vastly diminished during that time on with purposeful intent. When we talk about xenophobia, very quickly, I'm talking about the intersection of fear and the hatred of China and those of Chinese descent, which then is dispersed throughout Asian communities. I'm including Asian of all ethnicities, Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian, Central Asian, Polynesian, Pacific Islander. These intersection and the really the simplification and generalization of stating Chinese as if it is an entire group of people that has justified discrimination, racism, and bigotry. Even the media portrayal of immigrants in terms of right now, as we've reached this reckoning point, and this is not new. It's painful to hear that people are just now waking up to the anti-Asian sentiment, but this has been historical. And what has happened is COVID-19 didn't begin this. It was really this vehicle that then launched these anti-Asian, xenophobic, and xenophobic and racist views that allowed this opportunity by opportunists to be able to share the age-old stereotype historically of those, particularly of Asian descent, being dirty, being viral, and being a virus, being carrying illness, carrying disease, eating odd things, all of these incredible stereotypes that just weigh individuals down and dehumanize. Because when we dehumanize, then what we can literally do is then we can create these justifications to create and perpetuate the violence against humanity, violence against other individuals, and continue that harm. And that also then breaks apart other communities related to Asian, Black, Brown, Muslim, Indigenous. Like we do a great job harming one another. But when we look at this underneath this, it is very much systemic. And there was intentionality behind this. So, what happens with the impacts of the model minority, which is housed in the white supremacist model, is actually coined by the white sociologist William Peterson in 1966. So, this is about 1 year after the Civil Rights Act was amended, was passed. In a New York Times article that stated the success story of Japanese American style. So this began this idea of that we are hardworking as APIs, good at STEM, robotic in terms of empathy, robotic in terms of we will just do what has been told. We are the frontline workers. We are silent. We are docile. And underneath that model minority is also this consumption of parts of our culture, consumption of parts of our food, consumption of parts of what is believed to be us. Um, while yet at the same time then battling this very uh, harmful systemic idea that the model minority will not speak up. And this is also then reinforced because of oppression of so many elders who had been here, who had the opportunity to immigrate or had to come over because of violence in their own country, because of war, because of strife, or because of imperialism and colonialism by the West, particularly within countries, Myanmar, Vietnam, Korea, Japan. I can name so many more. The Philippines. We're talking about individuals who were then displaced, and the diaspora was also created that I must come over to survive. I cannot speak out. I'm afraid I won't be believed. I'm afraid I will sacrifice everything that I had to get to this point. And so we say nothing and we keep our head down and we keep working. But APIs in each generation have moved into this place, and people can only take so much, but really moved in this place of self awareness and also the space of reconciliation and a reclamation of identity, of who we are and where we belong, and that we belong to hold space. And so when this model minority, I talked about it was a wedge between other people of color. So look at the Asians who are doing all this, housed against this anti-blackness and Latinx, anti-brown, anti-indigenous. Why can't you do the same things? Why don't you have the same opportunities? When at the same time, it could falsely feel like that's great, but that's really confusing for individuals coming over, that we can both benefit and perpetuate this and actually be harmed by this. Because at the same time, they're not getting the same equitable pay, not getting equitable advancement, not getting equitable ability for internships or employment or equity when we go into other spaces. And yet at the same time, then be seen as a wedge within other communities when ultimately we were looking at the inclusion and the need to integrate our communities, particularly communities and marginalized communities of color together. Because at that time, then I can turn a blind eye to the white supremacy, where I can turn a blind eye to the white nationalism, why I'm fighting amongst everybody for the scraps of the table. And that is very, very exhausting. And it's also incredibly othering. So we're going to talk about what happens in terms of mental health. So it looks like an accolade, but it really is quite harmful, and it really is quite um, uh, hurtful and othering, and it's invisibilizing because it has invisibilized the systemic poverty, wealth, and health gaps within our API community. Because what is not being reported out is the disparity related to health, related to the medical equitability for the API community when it comes to vaccinations, when it's coming to even treatment related to COVID. Many APIs are too afraid to go to be treated because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them, afraid of not being believed if I'm sick, not being believed if I go to the police report, being afraid that ICE will be called on them in terms of immigration, that this idea that Asians are well off, quote unquote, when a vast majority and one of the largest sectors of communities of color at or below the poverty line, of the larger populations of APIs, are actually Asian identified. And it is very important because what that does is invisibilize. It also invisibilizes education equity, the number of clients who have come who have had underdiagnosis or overdiagnosis, underdiagnosis related to learning disabilities, dyscalculia, dyslexia, neurodiversity that have gone underreported because this model minority trope of like they are just doing their best and they're not saying anything. And then the mental health impacts, I should be able to do this, versus there's a neurological difference here and a divergence here. Or with this understanding that when I am placed into different environments, that racism and oppression and othering is creating a sense of anxiety. It's creating a sense that I'm supposed to be performing and doing, which is very much embedded with capitalism, of just perform, 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 and do, and prove up your value to the point that APIs are literally, it's killing them. And so these false expectations for and within the API community, particularly those who are allies and listening to this, is really understanding the historical nature behind that and what may be driving what appears to be this overperformance and an overabundance of being able to do all the things. Um, and so I'm going to skip through a few things because of time, but these slides will be available for those who are interested in terms of accessibility. Um, so the impacts on mental health, we have what I was talking about was anxiety, depression, this hypervigilance. Though I hear from many clients, particularly those clients of color, like it's presenting as in mainstream medical models, it's going to look like anxiety or agoraphobia. I don't want to leave the house. When we begin to deconstruct that, of course you don't want to leave the house. You're afraid if your family leaves the house. You're afraid of what will happen to you just to go out to a grocery store. And it's more than other peers who don't hold these marginalized identities, particularly racial identity. It is, I am a target and I can't take my essence off, nor should you. But this begins to have a very significant impact on our health long-term wise. So the intergenerational components of racism and oppression and colonialism is housed in our bones and our body. And just being able to affirm what that feels like, just to be able to affirm what this means for not just yourself, but I'm curious what that means for your family and how you identify. This may come up in sleep disturbances, particularly after the last week, in terms of the escalation and intensification of violence against the API community, that you're seeing so much media attention that has literally been ignored for years, now kind of front and center. And so really taking care of yourself in those moments, that you don't have to be on the forefront. And there's times that you're going to want the information and then times where you're going to have to back away from it for your own self-preservation, because it's a secondary trauma of seeing people who look just similar to you or to your elders or within community and knowing that I'm a target. It has significant impacts on our eating and digestion, that our brains and bodies are really responding to this identity-based stress and trauma, because this has been traumatic. Compromised immune systems and physical health. So long-term wise, there's a reason that APIs are at higher risk of contracting COVID. Unfortunately, this has not been discussed enough within media and medical um, in medical communities in general, even in terms of mental health, that when I'm under this much stress in terms of racism and oppression, I'm on high alert and my immune system is already activated. And that's going to create additional stress, especially if I'm not sleeping, if I'm not eating right, that my body is responding to something that is real and legitimate. And this can then activate what we call complex PTSD. So, long term impacts without some intervention, without affirmation assistance, can really have this activation that I am really feeling on edge. Particularly for those who have lived experience because of racially motivated violence and harm, even if it is not in full cognitive awareness, because our brains and bodies do a lot with trauma and it's got to compartmentalize some things to exist and to survive. And so many times people of color and Asian folks that I speak with may not recognize this as racist or bigotry or discrimination because it may be so overwhelming to deal with what is happening in front of me that I can't believe a professor called me out. And I don't know if it was race because the trauma of racism, there's really no words for it. We know when it's happening. When I'm shunned at the grocery store because of the way I look, my body has a traumatic response to that. It has a sympathetic response to what's going on because what's happening to me is discrimination and it's traumatizing because I didn't know it's just me being in this space. So, using substances to cope with different feelings or stress can also then have an impact. And I do want to go back really quickly. So, when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, a lot of this is we're looking at surviving. When we look at the long term impacts of trauma, we're also then looking at how race and ethnicity plays a role when I survive through the intergenerational of famine, oppression, of slavery, racial violence, of being othered. What happens is this consciousness, and for many who have come and immigrated into, for many family systems, integrated, it's also bringing in community and it's also bringing in your the ties of what you left in our bodies, in our minds, in the ideology. And so sometimes this creates this severe anxiety and depression. It impacts our self esteem and it impacts the way that we're going to navigate the world. So really quickly, I'm holding time because we're going to do a full stop at 2:30, but I want to give time for questions and come back to everyone. And so I'll just very quickly go, I won't go through all of these, but this internalization begins then to formulate in this low self-worth. And then we begin to overcompensate, we overwork. And this can look like burnout as well. And I think one of the things that people don't talk about enough, particularly within our community, API community, because it is, we look at the gender roles and expectations, sexuality, orientation, and we're also holding all of this idea of what I'm supposed to do to look as basically justify that I deserve to have space here, justify that I'm good enough, justify that I am upholding what my parents wanted me and what have brought me, or my grandparents came or sacrificed to get us here. And so when we begin to internalize of racism and xenophobia, it really can come into this place that I'm also working against systemic and institutional systems, as well as the systems that my family line has carried with them. So how do I create health? How do I create liberation and healing? So we're going to talk about that here. It can also create the self-doubt and crazy making. So those who hold marginalized identities know this. But when I am in a space where I'm really feeling shunned or othered, or someone has made a racial epithet, has slurred me and has assaulted. So I can nice that up and I can say, well, those are microaggressions, and I'm going to call it what it is. It's full on assault. It's assaultive, it's abusive, it's intrusive, and it's violent. Let's call it what it is, because it's not about intentionality, it's about the impact. It's abusive, it's violent, assaultive, and intrusive whenever there is a racial aggression toward anyone, and racism and oppression. So when we're gaslit and said people are just trying to be friendly and I shouldn't be rude, we begin to like doubt our own truth and our own reality. And in that, begin to doubt our body and begin to doubt our responses. And this can escalate into a space sometimes when I speak with clients into substance use. I've lost the cues to my body because I've been told to turn them off. So the things that would keep me recognizing this was traumatic for me, this was hurtful for me, this was violent and harmful for me, well, they're just being friendly and they didn't mean it that way, or you're being too sensitive. So that gaslighting can really do a one over on our own sense of security in self and security and trust with others. And so it's not uncommon that the superficial connection with others, because I'm trying to protect myself, comes into play in terms of like, I want to have relationship, but I don't know what to do with that. And so we begin to belittle ourselves again or overwork, when really, when I'm talking about that, then I'm looking at deconstructing white colonialism and supremacy within myself, that I am not blaming myself, but I'm looking at how the systems have impacted me, that this is not mine to blame myself for, but I deserve to hold space. So we talked about some of the symptoms. These are physical. This can look like panic attacks. Some of those may be familiar. These are unhealthy coping, and this is when I'm sharing out with clients. Please come and talk to somebody. Look at, what is this in workshops? What is this in terms of just seeking out assistance? When we look at suicidality or homicidal thoughts, this can also be passive. This can be, I just wish I wasn't here. I wish all this could go away. I want to control what's going on with me. I'm not quite sure what the red dot is. Denial, avoidance. Procrastinating is also what is called kind of a collapse. So when I hear from particularly students that they've been procrastinating, we're investigating how identity-based stress and trauma may be playing into this, because high-level thinking in the high brain isn't happening when I'm feeling traumatized all the time or when I'm in acute stress. And so helping clients find ways to be able to manage that stress is really important. But when we move into self-harm, self-harm can be from cutting or hitting self without the intention of suicide or homicide, but self-harm is really a coping mechanism. But this is where self-esteem has really been impacted, and a sense of self, of dissociating from our own bodies. And when we're removed from people's, when we're told that this isn't as legitimate, when we're told that someone can come in and murder us because they're having a bad day, it makes sense that people would dissociate from their own sense of their bodies and being embodied, and their sense of self. And so that dissociation between what is really happening to me versus what keeps me safe is a coping mechanism until it's not anymore. And that's called denial. So eating too much or too little, eating disordered or disordered eating is significant in our community, particularly Asian women and Asian identified femme. And that's a whole other topic that I would love to be able to talk about, related to our body image, perfectionism, colorism, and this Western standard of beauty. Like, who got to say that having lighter skin or a thinner body or all of these things was better? Who got to say that? I just think of the harm that creates in that the bodies and the roundness and the beauty that we hold of our people and how we identify is so profound and something to be celebrated. So, another one is isolating self from others. When we look then about managing, so this isn't about making all this go away. So often I'll hear, I just want this to go away. I just want to get through it. And I'm like, the only way is to go, not get over it, but go through this in relationship with someone who feels safe. So, who are your safe people? Who are the people that you can be you and be authentically you, or find parts of authentic pieces of yourself? Part of this is kind of coming back to the body, and particularly those who identify where the body has been harmed and the body has been violated or dismissed. The body is not a safe place to be. You were born into the wrong body. The body is not the gender identity that I connect with. This could be really challenging. But knowing that and being gentle with what you are housed in as claiming space, inherent space, both physically, spiritually, psychologically, collectively is so important. And so knowing when the fight and flight response goes off, it's a sign for others to know, hey, something is going on here. And so consciously, like slowing down breathing and reflectively, that slows down our heart rate. So it's one of the only biological functions we can do to slow that body down. Deep breathing, even just changing up environment, putting our face in ice water, of just kind of, um, you know, reminding ourselves, like, I am in this body without the dissociation of what feels comfortable for individuals to do to calm. So, some real basic coping strategies, nurturing yourself. I think this is the reclamation to reframe. Like, there's no right or wrong in this. A lot of like colonial Western norms is like there has to be X, Y, and Z, and you do this and you do that. And even that, and even in Asian practice and what we call Eastern medicine and practice, has really been co opted into these Western spaces and really disabused for what they are, I think, in terms of like yoga and mindfulness practices. And I'm definitely not poo pooing because there is legitimate research, evidence based research related to the benefits of that. But what I'm sharing is returning to the sense of body and embodiment and a sense of your land and of your peoples, and nurturing that spirit in yourself to practice a lot of compassion. That, what is mine to hold? I cannot be responsible to change this entire system, but what I can hold today is that I will take care of my body in a way that, and my mind and my energy levels in a way that will not compromise me, in a way that will be liberating against this very capitalist work, 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 perform, perform. That if I need a break, I'm going to give myself a break. That's not selfish. If I have just done a 2-hour study session, I give myself permission, as not as a reward, but as a part of my routine and ritual of self compassion and self care and love. Like, this is what my brain and body needs. And this is so counterintuitive for so many. Crafting a safe space to be authentic, who are the people who you get to show up with? Cultivating ancestral and cultural understanding. And this doesn't mean, I hear from a lot of clients, particularly adoptees or fosterees or those who hold multiracial identities. Like, I don't know where to choose. And here's the thing, you don't have to make this choice. Like, the binary is a sham. There is no such thing as a binary. We are, the Dr. Jennifer Mullen had shared that out from Decolonizing Therapy. Like, the binary of this black and white ideal is really, colonialist. So when we hold that and think, I can live in the spectrum of all these different things, and that, who do I claim as my people right now? How do I reconnect to that within my heart, within my mind? Getting up and moving, getting up and having a routine can be so important. And that moves into eating and sleeping. That when we care for our schedules, we care for ourselves, it is a place of liberation. that I can show up for others when I can show up for myself. And sometimes that's really hard when we fight in terms of this Western ideology of like this independence um, but it really is about self compassion. And we think about the intergenerational trauma for many family systems that had to survive. And so, in a lot of ways, you're also breaking some intergenerational bond, not the bond of relationship, but belief systems. That doesn't have to upend your culture, your morality, or your beliefs, but it begins to set this healthy stage in terms of your own boundaries, not as this Western white model, but as a space of like reconnecting to self and to your ancestors and to your space, and really affording the privilege and the power to do so. That's empowering. So knowing that you can prepare for it, and you know what, avoid the unnecessary stress if you don't have to. I'm all about, like, I know if I'm moving into a space, I'm going to need some time to decompress because I'm code switching and my head hurts, and I'm going to need a good hour to two or nothing else for the rest of the day. So I may have to chunk my day out in another way. And that is okay. That I can care for myself in this way. Can I allow that and then begin to model that with other people? Change what you can and accepting what you can't. And this is hard, particularly if you were brought up where you're responsible to do all these things. I'm also the eldest and the oldest, so there's a lot of complexity to that, and where that fits in terms of role and dynamics in your family. So it is not selfish to put yourself first. We have to make space to take care of ourselves, or else, we're going to suffer. Balancing our values with our family and cultural values, integrating that. And I go back because sometimes I'm challenged by the word balance, but I think the reclamation, what is that going to look like for you? And that's going to be different for everyone. Sometimes this idea of mythology that self care can only happen, or self compassion when I'm alone, or I finish this. Again, this is not a reward for existing. This is sustainability and management. Sustainability and management to take up space. Um, Stop API hate. Many of y'all have heard about this. I'm putting this up here, and you can find this also on our website through SEC. It is legitimate and it is real. I have met family members as well as clients, particularly clients of color, they do not trust legal authority right now for very good reason. And so reporting to AAPI, stop AAPI hate. It can also be, you do not have to give out all of your information, but it does help track what's going on and can also be empowering. And so if you're situated in a space where I'm not quite sure what to do, please, there are several places on campus you can reach out. Counseling Center is one. We are not mandatory reporters, and the health center is not a mandatory reporter. All other departments are under SB 212. That's the state legislature. And so as you navigate this, we want to encourage that there's other spaces to be able to share or get consult. Tomorrow, the SEC, along with ISS and ISSC, will be doing or ISSO, will be doing another brief panel that I'll be on talking about, particularly for international students or students who are concerned about their family members who may not have U.S. citizenship or green card status, about what do I do? What would happen if I get pulled over? Do I have the right to protest? You do. What will happen if, ICE is called? So a lot of these questions that are proliferating in our community, and legitimately so, will be addressed tomorrow and then through other webinars. This is our services, and I do want to offer space for additional questions. So these are all offered online right now, virtually. I don't know when we will be opening up our offices, but for safety at this point, that's what we'll be doing in terms of COVID. But we do all of these offer services. These are part of your tuition. You've been paying these fees. Please utilize so we can at least provide mental health assistance. Here's our number that you can find. I want to let people know. So if you have a crisis or emergency, you can call UTD Talk after 4 o'clock. We shut everything digitally down, not necessarily scheduling if you're an ongoing client, but digitally down at 4 so we can address and ensure that people are scheduled equitably and as soon as possible. Okay, so I'm going to open this back up here in shops. I've just given a lot, but I do want to answer any questions. And you know what? I'm going to stop the recording so people can. I stopped recording.